Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And today, we've got another top 10 video. Today, we're going to be looking at the top 10 stupidest things that were ever part of Battleship design. Again, this list is my own opinion, so your list may differ. And we're specifically looking at battleships and battle cruisers here. Some of these things were done on smaller vessels with success, but I think did not work particularly well on battleships. So, as always, feel free to disagree with me or agree, and let us know in the comment section what your thoughts are on the top 10 list. In the number 10 position, I have diesel power. Now, some battleships, like the Iowa class, have auxiliary diesel generators for creating electrical power. That's great, that worked fine. But some battleships, particularly German designs from World War I and World War II, attempted to use diesel power to drive the entire ship. Or, like the World War I designs, they just wanted one or more of the propeller shafts run off of diesel for cruising at long range, and other shafts run off of a traditional steam plant. Germany spent a lot of money trying to develop this and ended up with no workable product at the end. Don't get me wrong, diesel power worked fine for the commerce rating pocket battleships, but blowing it up to full-on battleship size never worked, and all of the resources Germany put into this was a waste. German battleships were never supposed to be designed for long range. They didn't have acceptable crew accommodations. The crew lived ashore, moved onto the ship for a voyage out into the North Sea to fight the Royal Navy, and then the survivors come home and go back ashore. So making your battleships extremely long range with cruising stuff and blah, 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 it makes no sense for Germany given their doctrine. During World War II, with diesels for their commerce rating ships and having a doctrine of using battleships as commerce raiders, it starts to make a little bit more sense. But also the ships have ballooned in size to these really absurdly gigantic ships that just aren't effective as commerce raiders. So, not a good idea at that time. And maybe it could be done today, but didn't make sense for their doctrine or their technology. In the number 9 slot, sky guns. This was a concept that wasn't used too frequently. I can only think of U.S. Navy ships that did this, particularly Battleship Texas had a pair of sky guns mounted. What is a sky gun? The U.S. Navy took a 3-inch 50 caliber gun and mounted it on top of a crane derrick, put a little basket around it, and then had the idea that, well, these guys need some sort of protection, so they were going to somehow get their hammocks up there to pad the railing to give them some sort of splinter protection. So now they've got an anti-aircraft gun that's mounted pretty high up in the ship. You can fire down on torpedo bombers if you want, and it keeps your precious deck space free. But how do you get ammunition up to the sky gun? The whole point of AA guns is you're firing fast to put enough flak in the sky to try and shoot down a plane, and there isn't much room for ready service ammo on top of a crane derrick, and there isn't any hoist that gets it up there, so presumably it had some sort of chain fall or block and tackle, and one of the few guys that could cram up there is just hauling these projectiles up to the gun, and now you've got loose ordnance hanging above the deck in battle. Fortunately, like I said, this wasn't widely used. This wasn't used outside the United States to the best of my knowledge, and it was removed pretty early on. This is one of the earliest attempts at mounting anti-aircraft guns on warships, and they find out it doesn't work and get rid of it. And all that. I didn't even mention that, that crane post is probably vibrating with the ship moving and all that weight up there, so you're not even aiming accurately. So that one's only in the number 9 slot because it wasn't particularly widely used. In the number 8 slot, I have an echelon mounted turrets. So a number of battleships, starting with the British Invincible class battle cruisers, have turrets mounted, one on each side of the ship, but in theory, they can fire cross deck to give you both broadsides. Again, we talked about this in the turret farm video. There's a link to that in the description below. But British didn't want to concentrate all their guns forward and aft because they were worried that one shell could knock out all their guns, so they spread them out along the deck. And with them spread out along the deck, that limits their arcs of fire. So the idea was, if you mount one on each side, they can still fire cross deck because you've got open deck there around them. That open deck can be used to store ships' boats. But in practice, the blast effects of firing the guns cross deck was an issue. So in reality, that was never really done. It would damage the boats. It would damage the superstructure. It limits the amount of superstructure you can have, and so limits the interior volume of the ship. So your ship is more cramped because you can't put superstructure around most of the midships part of the vessel. And spreading out turrets all over your deck like that means that almost any shell that hits your ship has the potential of penetrating down to a magazine, because now your magazines are spread out all over the ship. So, an echelon turrets, bad idea. Not the worst idea that's ever attempted with turrets. I've got a couple more up this list that are primarily gun related that are worse than that. It was a step in the right direction. Centerline turrets are better, and centerline turrets mounted fore and aft, so they've got the largest possible arc of fire, are best. But most people tried a lot of stuff. In the number 7 position, we've got spotting posts directly over smokestacks. This is another thing that the British primarily are guilty of. Especially their earliest dreadnoughts, like HMS Dreadnought, has a reverse-facing tripod and the smokestack right between it, which means that all of that coal-fired smoke blows right up into your spotting position, and your guys trying to spot the fall of shot for the main guns can't see a thing. HMS Dreadnought only had one spotting post. Later battleships added additional ones. American battleships almost always had 2 during this period, and eventually this gets somewhat corrected. Realistically, this is pretty low on the list because with coal-fired ships, you're always making black smoke, and that black smoke is just going to obscure some of your spotting positions just because of what it is. As the ship is moving through the water, that's causing the smoke to blow back, so your after spotting position is almost always going to be choked out with these exhaust gases. However, not building your spotting post directly above or behind a smokestack really helps with that. And the British just didn't get that right with Dreadnought. They were limited. That's where the boilers were, so that's where the exhaust needed to be. They didn't want to trunk it all the way through the ship. That makes sense. The locations of the turrets forced the boiler and engine rooms to be in some weird places because those were spread out all over the ship. That makes sense. Primarily the early British battleships, both for their own Royal Navy use and for export, such as the Brazilian Minas Gerais class. In the number 6 position, I've got wing-mounted turrets. This is very similar to an echelon-mounted turret. This was the design principle that came before that and prior to just throwing everything on the center line. Wing-mounted turrets involves having 2 turrets, one on each side of the ship, pretty much next to each other, or maybe with a superstructure in between. HMS Dreadnought had this. Early German dreadnoughts had a hexagonal arrangement of them. And this is kind of a callback to earlier pre-dreadnought battleships that had their secondary turreted battleship in those sorts of positions. But in practice, you're installing 2 turrets and the full weight of 2 turrets when you can only ever fire one on the broadside. Granted, if you're firing forward or aft, you have more firepower than if you just had center line turrets. But that was a rare feat, and the arcs of fire of these guns weren't really that great. So if you were just a little bit off of center line, suddenly you lose that other turret. It's a whole lot of weight for nothing. And because it's mounted on the side of the ship, that means that you've got to add more armor plate on that side of the ship over the magazines, because there's no depth to your protection like with the centerline turret. There's a projectile coming through the side of the ship can go straight into your barbette and cause all sorts of issues. I'm not aware of this ever happening, but not only do you have to have extra weight of turret, you now have to have extra weight of armor in that area. So wing-mounted turrets, a bad idea. It's an understandable design feature coming out of pre-dreadnoughts into early dreadnoughts, and it makes sense that within very short order they go from wing turrets to an echelon turrets, and then from an echelon to all center line, and from all center line to all fore and aft. Maybe they should have stopped and thought about turret placement. They were so concerned with, can we get the most barrels on our ships, that they didn't think about, are these barrels actually going to be useful? In my number 5 position, I've got hull-mounted sponsons. So, very common with early dreadnought battleships to have openings in the ship's hull for your secondary battery. And this ended up being a bad idea. American battleships, pretty much from our earliest dreadnoughts straight on up through the Mississippi class, were designed with these hull-mounted guns. You can see them very clearly on Texas, Arizona, ships like that as originally built. This is problematic because it's taking up a lot of your interior hull volume, and it's big openings in the side of the ship, which proved to be an issue when these ships were operating in the North Atlantic, particularly where you're getting high waves covering your ships. Earlier pre-dreadnought battleships tended to be purely coastal, so this wasn't a big issue. They are direct descendants of ships of the line, and so they have a ton of broadside guns, and so they're mounting guns in the hull like they always had. But by the dreadnought era, you would think we would have moved beyond this. The arcs of fire of these guns have been opened significantly from broadside guns so that they can fire, and the entire hull is sculpted in weird ways to give these guns large arcs of fire to be able to fire forward and along the broadside and whatnot. But to do this, you're making a much larger hole in the hull. And granted, there are metal plates that are supposed to cover that, but they're not watertight. And these guns are basically in berthing spaces and mess spaces. So now you've got cold North Atlantic water, maybe not enough to endanger the ship, but it's coming into these spaces where the crew is eating and living. It's causing mold and all sorts of other issues. These ships are damp and cold. And just bad idea all the way around, particularly by the dreadnought era. And it's relatively late in the dreadnought era before these are removed. Granted, the American ships during this period are broken decked, which means that their main deck is the one that goes full forward to aft, but only the aft part of it is fully open. And then there's a raised deck from about midships forward that is the 01 level, and that's where most of these guns are mounted. So they are technically above the main deck, and they're technically in a weather deck. But in practice, that's interior volume of your hull. One of the earliest things that the U.S. Navy does post-World War I when they're modernizing their ships is bumps all of these up into the superstructure level. And that's a much better place for them. Number 4, and this one would be mounted higher, but it only applies to a certain time period. That is single-purpose secondary guns. During World War I, single-purpose secondary guns made sense. There wasn't any major air threat. But by the interwar period and World War II, it makes no sense at all for ships to have single-purpose secondary guns. The aircraft threat is at least as big, if not bigger, than the threat posed by torpedo boats, destroyers, and other smaller vessels. So the fact that ships like Yamato, Bismarck, Littorio, and Richelieu all have single-purpose secondary guns, typically of a 6-inch or 5.9-inch, 6.1-inch diameter, makes no sense. The 5-inch gun has plenty of stopping power and a higher rate of fire because you can more quickly manually load that lighter shell, and it can be used as an anti-aircraft round. These nations were deficient in developing dual-purpose secondary guns, and they really suffered for it during World War II. Their ships suffered from air attacks significantly more than Allied ships that did have dual-purpose guns and could defend themselves better. In the number 3 position, and I promise this is the last one dealing with gun turret placement, and this one is a purely American one, Superfiring turrets. Now, there are 2 types of superfiring turrets, and I don't mean both of them. Most American battleships always had, dreadnought battleships had superfiring turrets where one turret is mounted above and behind the one in front of it, so that you can fire both of them. That's great. However, early American battleships like the Kearsarge class and the Virginia class had superfiring turrets where there was an 8-inch turret mounted on top of a 12 or 13-inch turret. What's the positive about this? Why did the United States try to develop this? Older pre-dreadnought battleships tended to have wing-mounted 8-inch guns, which means you could fire 2 turrets in any direction. 2 forward, 2 aft, 2 on each broadside. So you have one mounted on each corner of the superstructure. The U.S. Navy thinks to themselves, well, how can we mount these center line so that we can fire 3 turrets on any broadside? And so the ships were supposed to have one mounted on each wing and then one mounted on top of each turret. Pre-dreadnought battleships tend to stay within the same size range. They do not balloon in size the way that dreadnoughts do. And so they all tend to have the same main and secondary battery guns and the same layout, and there just isn't that much centerline space to mount a turret in the good kind of superfiring way. So the U.S. Navy says, all right, let's drop these turrets on top of the existing turrets. With the Kearsarge class, it wasn't the worst thing in the world, believe it or not. The next several classes of battleships moved away from it, but Kearsarge was a crack gunnery ship, so she didn't suffer too much. Those older main battery guns had such a slow rate of fire that the 8-inch guns mounted on top didn't really get interference from it. Now, all the shell handling and everything had to come through the lower turret and get into the upper turret, and the upper turret does not rotate independently. So your upper turret is aiming wherever your main battery turret is aiming, which at that time, when you're engaging at relatively short ranges, isn't an issue. But later on, as your main battery guns are able to hit targets at longer ranges, they need significantly more deflection. They need to lead their target more than the gun on top needs to. And as the rate of fire improves, suddenly the faster firing lower main battery gun is interrupting shell handling and aiming of the gun up above. So with the Kearsarge class, it's an interesting experiment. Then the U.S. Navy goes from these big round turrets that maybe have enough room inside for the shell handling for the upper turret, and goes to a more traditionally shaped, square, flat-faced, elongated turret. And nobody else tries to adopt this insane idea. But then with the Virginia-class pre-dreadnought battleships, ships that are built around the same time that HMS Dreadnought is being built, and one of the last classes of pre-dreadnoughts, the U.S. Navy tries to go back to it, and it just doesn't work. And the U.S. Navy likes the idea enough that with their dreadnoughts, they go to superfiring when they've got the room to do it. But on pre-dreadnoughts, it's a bad idea. Number 2, torpedo tubes. The great range of the main battery of battleships meant that torpedo tubes were useless. They were holes in the armored hull of the ship, or, like the German battleships did, they are just warheads sitting exposed on the main deck in torpedo tube launchers, like Scharnhorst and Tirpitz had. I have no idea why any World War II battleships carried torpedo tubes. This is one that practically every pre-dreadnought and dreadnought type battleship up through the end of World War II had. I can only think of one time that these tubes were used in combat, and that is when HMS Rodney, a ship built in the 1920s, tries to torpedo Bismarck. Bismarck is utterly disabled, and so Rodney is able to get within range. There's no evidence that that torpedo actually hit the target, and shrapnel from a near miss from Bismarck might have impacted one of the torpedo tube doors on Rodney and caused some leaking. So these are holes in your underwater hull. They tend to be fixed positions, either on the bow or the side of the ship. This causes issues. You've got to be perfectly broadside to your target to fire them. Also, if your ship is going at any speed, the torpedo trying to exit the tube broadside is getting pulled by that current and whipped in the wrong direction or sheared off. There are just so many issues with these things. It baffles me that everybody kept retaining them. It's one of those weapon systems, because everybody has it, well, we've got to have it. And granted, nobody expected battles to be fought at the ranges that they end up being fought. And so it's purely on hindsight that we're able to look back and be like, if their guns could shoot 10, 12, 15 miles, why didn't they just plan on fighting at those ranges, knowing that, hey, if my guns can shoot this far, I'm not going to try and push in closer during a major engagement. And so battleships never really get into range to use their torpedo tubes against each other. The one time that it happens, and Rodney's having trouble sinking Bismarck with main battery guns, the torpedo either fails to detonate or misses entirely, or maybe it was a hit and just nobody realized it. Regardless, it didn't contribute to the loss of the ship. Submarines, destroyers have large amounts of torpedoes, so they can fire a spread and they're likely to get multiple hits. Battleships tended to have 1 or 2 on each broadside, and they're an explosion hazard. One of the leading theories on the destruction of Hood is that her torpedoes are what are detonated that cause sympathetic detonations throughout the rest of the ship. Honestly, I'm surprised that doesn't happen more often. Torpedoes have rather large warheads. And finally, that brings me to my number 1 bad design feature of battleships, and that is Paravanes. Why on earth would you use your most expensive and powerful warship as a minesweeper? Granted, some navies, like the US Navy, tends to not operate minesweepers in significant quantities in wartime. That's because they're so small that if we get into a war, we can just build and commission a ton real fast, and we've got minesweepers now. Great, no problem. And granted, you don't want your battleship to not have a capability. What if she accidentally blunders into a minefield? You might need those Paravanes. I can't think of a single instance where Paravanes benefited battleships. Maybe some of the pre-dreadnoughts in the Dardanelles used them. But then again, several of them were sunk by mines during that campaign off Gallipoli in World War I, so they can't have worked that great. Battleships are bad ships to use as a minesweeper. It's better to just stop them if you think you're in a minefield and wait for some of your escorts to clear the way. Now, if you want more information on how a Paravane works, there's a link in the video description to that. We filmed on the Battleship Massachusetts. It still has them. Fortunately, the Iowa-class battleships had theirs removed at some point in their career, but they were built with them. And we still have a couple of pieces of equipment installed that were used in association with the Paravanes. And they were at least removed by the Vietnam Commission because that Paravane winch was used for something else. But essentially, You've got these torpedo-shaped things that have wings on them. They're chained to the very bow of the ship, and as you move through the water at a certain speed, they come up on either side, and they're tethered to the ship by a cable, and they're supposed to catch mines, which are anchored to the seafloor by chains, cut those mines loose so they float to the surface, and then your Marines are supposed to shoot them with rifles and make them explode before they hit the ship. If that sounds utterly absurd to you, it's because it is. But it also highlights a major weakness of battleships. Battleships are very vulnerable to underwater explosions, even ones built with torpedo defense after the vulnerability was realized. It's a real cheap way to disable your enemy's most powerful asset. And so I guess it makes sense that everybody tried to put a defense for this on their ships, but battleships should not be used as minesweepers. So, what does your top 10 worst design features of battleships look like? Did I miss anything? Do you think I should have rearranged things? Let us know in the comments section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to support us so we can keep making content like this. You can also support the museum through liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find out about our channel. Thanks for watching.